Peter had left behind his nets, his boats, and his family to follow Jesus. He had witnessed miracles, walked upon the waters, and vowed eternal loyalty. But one day, along the road, the Master turned to him and called him Satan. Why would Jesus say something so harsh to his most devoted friend? Today, you'll discover the truth behind one of the most striking moments in the Gospels. What you'll learn will transform the way you understand divine love and true obedience. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what topic you'd like to see next. Jesus and his disciples were walking the dusty roads of the north near Caesarea Philippi, a region filled with temples dedicated to pagan gods. The air smelled of incense and superstition. In the midst of that atmosphere, Jesus began to ask them, "Who do people say that I am?" Their answers came through murmurs. Some said he was a prophet, others that he was John come back to life. Then Peter, with steadfast eyes and a burning heart, declared, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." His voice cut through the silence like thunder over the mountain. That day the fisherman was lifted up as rock and promise. But soon he would learn that faith without the cross becomes only a shadow. Jesus looked at him tenderly and said, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah." That simple man from Galilee was called the rock upon which the church would be built. It was the highest point of his faith, the summit of his devotion. The other disciples looked at him with admiration and a touch of envy. Peter felt his heart burning with divine certainty. He believed he understood the plan of the Messiah, but he did not yet know that this revelation would soon be tested. Shortly after, Jesus began to speak to them openly about what awaited him: betrayal, suffering, death, and resurrection on the third day. The air grew heavy. The disciples fell silent, unable to take in what they were hearing. Peter stepped forward, took Jesus by the arm, and pulled him aside. His voice trembled between anguish and love. "Lord, don't say that. May God forbid it." He wanted to protect him, but in his zeal was hidden a mistake he could not yet understand. Then Jesus turned to him. His gaze, deep and burning like fire, pierced through Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said, "for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of men." Silence fell over them all. The word struck Peter's soul like a blade. It wasn't an insult, it was spiritual surgery. In that moment, Peter realized that loving Jesus was not enough if his love did not embrace the cross. It was the highest and most painful lesson of his life. Jesus didn't stop there. He used everyone's confusion to teach a truth that would change their lives forever. "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me." The words fell like a hammer upon hearts that still longed for a political kingdom. The crowd fell silent. That single phrase shattered their illusions. Jesus had not come to avoid suffering, he came to redeem it. Glory was not found on the throne, but in obedience. Peter still felt the echo of that rebuke within him. Inside, shame, love, and confusion intertwined. How could the Messiah speak of dying if he had come to save? His human mind could not grasp the language of sacrifice. Sometimes faith stumbles not from lack of love, but from fear of losing what it loves most. Peter had tried to protect Jesus, not realizing he was attempting to stop the very plan that would one day save him. As evening fell, they sat by the fire. The embers crackled, and the silence grew heavy. Peter watched the hands of Jesus, those same hands that healed, multiplied bread, and lifted the fallen. He thought about how those very hands would soon be pierced. A lump formed in his throat. Jesus looked at him, and without a word, his gaze spoke of the pain necessary to fulfill purpose. It was the decisive moment when human love had to die so that holy love could be born. Days later, they resumed their journey toward Jerusalem. The sun burned upon the land, and the wind lifted dust from the roads. No one dared to mention that rebuke. Peter walked behind in silence, carrying the invisible weight of his wounded pride. Jesus moved ahead with firm steps, knowing that each one brought him closer to the cross. In that contrast of silence and destiny, the soul of the disciple was being forged, the one who would one day be restored by grace. When they reached the outskirts of the city, Jesus spoke again about the cost of following him. What good is it for a man to gain the whole world, yet lose his soul? Peter listened quietly. That question pierced his heart. He understood that his mistake had not been loving too much, but loving wrongly. Love that avoids pain ends up betraying truth. Only the one who accepts dying to self can fully live within God's plan. That night, while the others slept, Peter withdrew from the camp. The sound of the wind through the branches accompanied him like a lament. He sat upon a rock, looked up at the sky, and thought of the words that had wounded him. "Get behind me, Satan." He repeated them again and again until his voice broke. How could the master see something so dark within him? He did not yet know that this wound would become the doorway to his true transformation. He remembered the days by the lake when Jesus had called him from the shore. "Follow me," he had said, and his life changed forever. But now that same Jesus seemed distant, incomprehensible. Peter did not understand that God's love sometimes comes disguised as confrontation. Tears streamed down his face. The man who had once walked on water now struggled to stay standing amid an invisible storm. In his mind, two voices echoed. One said, "Protect him." The other, "Trust." And it was the fiercest battle he had ever faced, not against external enemies, but against his own heart. Peter wanted to serve, but on his own terms. Jesus had shown him that the true enemy was not outside, but within. That night he realized that the greatest obstacle for a disciple is not fear, but pride disguised as love. When dawn began to paint the horizon, Peter returned to the others. He spoke to no one, but his gaze was no longer the same. The fire that once burned in pride now trembled in humility. Jesus saw him approaching and smiled. No words were needed. Sometimes forgiveness does not come through speeches, but through a single look. Peter understood that God does not seek perfect disciples. He seeks hearts willing to surrender. As they resumed their journey, Peter watched the feet of Jesus covered in dust. Those feet were walking toward the cross, and for the first time, he chose to follow without questioning. His silence became a prayer, each step an act of surrender. He no longer tried to understand everything, only to stay close. That day, a purer faith was born within him, a faith forged not when all is clear, but when one obeys even without understanding. As they walked toward Jerusalem, Jesus began to speak again about surrender, about losing one's life to find it. The disciples looked at each other in confusion, but Peter no longer argued. His once impulsive heart had become attentive. The Master spoke of dying, and each word sounded like a seed falling on fertile ground. What once seemed madness now began to make sense. Only those who die to themselves can bear eternal fruit. In every village, Jesus met crowds who followed him for his miracles, yet few understood the cost of discipleship. Peter watched their faces and thought of his own, that day when he had been called Satan. He no longer saw it as an insult, but as a warning. He realized that the words of the Master do not destroy, they purify. The voice that once wounded him was now rebuilding him from within. One afternoon, as they stopped along the way, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up a high mountain. There, his face shone like the sun, and his garments became dazzling white. It was the Transfiguration. Peter fell to his knees, speechless. He saw Moses and Elijah speaking with the Master. In that moment, he understood that the kingdom was not a throne of this world, but a glory born from sacrifice. Fear mingled with adoration. When they descended from the mountain, Peter remained silent. The vision still burned in his mind. He now understood that Jesus had to suffer to redeem. What he once tried to prevent was revealed as the holiest work in history. Sometimes God shows us his glory only so that we can endure the pain to come. Peter did not yet know it, but that experience would become his anchor in the nights of doubt that awaited him. The group pressed on toward Jerusalem, and the atmosphere grew tense. Some leaders were already plotting Jesus' death. Peter, though afraid, walked steadily. The old rebuke had now become his strength. He had learned not to trust his emotions, but the word of his master. The love that once sought to protect God had transformed into love that submits to his will. It was the beginning of a mature discipleship, shaped by fire and grace. The journey to Jerusalem became a march through shadows. Jesus spoke ever more clearly about his death, but also about his victory. Peter listened carefully, though deep inside, he feared losing him. The holy city rose in the distance, wrapped in a golden glow. Each step lifted dust and promises. Within the disciple's heart, hope and fear intertwined. He loved the Messiah, but dreaded the cost of following him. One night, as they rested near Bethany, Peter drew close to the fire. The Master spoke calmly about the kingdom that is not of this world. "Many will call me Lord, but not all will follow me to the end," he said. Peter lowered his gaze. He remembered his impulsiveness, his desire to protect, his pride disguised as loyalty. He understood that following is not measured by promises, but by perseverance. True faith is tested when the applause falls silent. The next day, as they crossed the Mount of Olives, Jesus warned them, "This very night all of you will fall away because of me." Peter felt a blow to his chest. "Even if everyone else abandons you, I never will," he replied. Jesus looked at him with compassion and said, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." Silence filled the air. Peter wanted to protest, but he couldn't. Those words were both a prophecy and a promise. He would fall, but he would rise again. When the night of the Last Supper came, Peter sat close to Jesus. The air was heavy with foreboding. As the Master broke the bread and said, "This is my body," Peter felt as if time had stopped. He couldn't understand how the one who had multiplied loaves was now offering his own body as a sacrifice. In that moment, he realized that surrender was not defeat, but the highest expression of love. His soul trembled between fear and awe. Jesus rose from the table, took a towel, and began to wash the feet of his disciples. When he came to Peter, Peter pulled back. "You will never wash my feet," he exclaimed. But the Master answered calmly, "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." Peter bowed his head, broken. "Then, Lord, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." That night, he understood that true love kneels. It was the highest point of his surrender. Night fell over Jerusalem like a cloak of judgment. The Master was arrested amid torches and shouts. Peter, his heart burning, followed him from a distance. Shadows swallowed him as the echo of chains mixed with the wind. Every step was a battle between love and fear. He wanted to defend Jesus, but he remembered those words, "Get behind me, Satan." He knew that zeal without obedience could destroy him once more. In the courtyard of the high priest, the embers burned. Peter drew near to warm himself, trying to remain unnoticed. Just a few feet away, Jesus was being questioned, his face bruised, his silence serene. A woman looked at Peter and said, "You were with him too." His heart froze. "I don't know him," he murmured. The words slipped out without thought, a reflex of survival. It was the same voice that had once promised to die for his master, now breaking in cowardice. Again, he was recognized. "You are one of his disciples." Peter denied it more fiercely this time, with fear and tears mixed together. At that moment, a rooster crowed, shattering the stillness of dawn. Jesus turned his head and their eyes met. There was no reproach, only compassion. That look pierced Peter's soul deeper than any word could. He realized that the rebuke from the past had never been anger, but a warning born of love. Peter fled to the Mount of Olives and fell to his knees. He wept until his voice was gone. His tears echoed from a soul broken to its depths. There, in the darkness, he finally understood what Jesus had meant. You are not thinking of the things of God. The enemy he had to cast away was not an external demon, but his own pride. In his fall, he discovered mercy. In his shame, he found the beginning of forgiveness. Faith was now being born from the ashes. Days passed, the tomb was opened, and the news of the resurrection shook the earth. Peter ran at dawn alongside John. The air smelled of hope. When he entered the tomb and saw it empty, he fell to his knees. He realized that the one he had denied had kept his word. Jesus had conquered death, even for him. The fallen disciple was lifted up again. The stone that had stumbled would become the foundation of a new era of grace. Days later, by the Sea of Galilee, Peter went back to fishing. It was as if he wanted to return to the beginning, to where it had all started. But the night was fruitless. He caught nothing. At dawn, a voice called from the shore, "Cast your net on the right side." When they did, the net overflowed with fish. Peter recognized the voice. It was Jesus. Without waiting for the boat, he threw himself into the water and swam toward him. The man who had fallen was now running again toward grace. On the shore, Jesus waited for him by the fire, just like that night of denial. He looked at him tenderly and asked, "Simon, do you love me?" Peter, his voice trembling, answered, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." 3 times Jesus repeated the question, and 3 times the disciple restored the denials of his soul. Jesus did not rebuke him. Instead, he entrusted him with a mission. Feed my sheep. The love that once tried to avoid the cross was now forever united to it. Then Peter understood why Jesus had called him Satan. It had not been rejection. It was revelation. He had wanted to protect God instead of obeying him, to love without sacrifice, to follow without dying to himself. Years later, he too would die on a cross, but with his face turned toward heaven. Thus, his circle was completed, from denial to purpose, from pride to surrender. And you, would you keep loving God when his path leads you to the cross? May his grace always strengthen you. Subscribe, share, and may the Lord bless you.